it's 11 o'clock on a Wednesday, which means it is time for live your weekly live stream with ocean scientists from UWA Oceans Institute. My name is Tina, and yes, I am your landlocked, land-loving, non-marine scientist host. But today, joining us, we've actually got two lovely guests. We have Taylor Simpkins, who is a coral reef expert, and we have Monroe Garner, who is an underwater photographer. Wave hello. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time this week, welcome. For those of you who are coming back, thank you for coming again. Just to go through the rules are very much the same. We have about an hour with our lovely guests. We'll be talking through a few different things, including their recent expeditions to frozen wastelands in the tropics. But if you have your own questions, feel free to drop them in at any time. We have Rob, who is hidden behind the scenes as always. Rob is one of our very special Oceans Institute gremlins. He is a deep sea creature of the abyss. He's not allowed on camera for our safety and yours. But he's there. He's going to be scouring through the chat log looking for questions that you have for our guests and make sure that you keep talking to us. But we'll get started. So as you can see, Brett and Taylor are not observing the social distancing rules. That is because they live together. They're a couple. But they are observing or have been observing the self-isolation rules because Brett has just been on an adventure.
That's right. So we've been, or specifically I've been confined to my room for 2 weeks. That was up 3 days ago, which was nice because I just came back from Antarctica. So I flew in and had to self-isolate for 2 weeks. But yeah, I was on an expedition down to Antarctica and South Georgia and the Falkland Islands, which was pretty nice.
So Antarctica, I've never been. Obviously, if you have been, tell us in the chat log. We'd be surprised and happy to hear that. But what were you doing in Antarctica, Brett?
So I work as an underwater photographer, and I'm a diver, a polar diver. So we went down, and I was diving in the cold waters to take photo and video of what we find. And it's part of a National Geographic expedition. So I was also working as kind of a guest lecturer on a ship that had guests. So we go down.
Okay. So you're a guest lecturer. Does that mean that you have guests who are on the expedition with you? How does that work?
Yeah, that's right. So it's an expedition ship. It has about 100 guests. And we go down and do a bit of exploring and find what we can find and show them a good time, but also, like I said, do a bit of exploring and dive in places where people have never been diving before. And we also do a little bit of citizen science as well while we're down there. Pretty exciting. The biggest project we're working on now is a plastics project. So we dig plastic toes in the really remote areas and try to get some baseline data on microplastics in the Southern Ocean.
Awesome. What I might do is, you had some really nice footage earlier. Do you mind just sharing that across?
Yeah, that's fine.
So I think most of us would never have been to Antarctica, certainly not me. So it'd be nice to see what kind of footage you got. And the other question I've got is a really basic question. How cold does it get?
Yeah, so the water temperature varies from about 4 degrees to -2, maybe a touch above -2 degrees. Yeah, and there we can see the penguins. These are Gentoo penguins. I had a great opportunity this year to free dive with them. So normally we're in dry suits in these cold waters, but I purchased a really thick wetsuit, a 9mm 2-piece wetsuit. Put about
that's about there.
It's pretty thick, yeah, and it's 2-piece. So you have a top, you have like a Farmer John kind of overall, and then a top layer. So on your chest, it's 18mm, quite thick. It's really buoyant. So I strap about as much weight as I can get on a belt, and then was able to free dive with these penguins. But the benefit of having a wetsuit is that you can get under the water. You're not just a cork on the surface in a dry suit, which is basically like a big balloon that's around your body.
Awesome. So you're not the only one that's been traveling. I know that Taylor's just come back from a recent expedition as well. Somewhere a little bit different, somewhere a little bit closer to home, I'm guessing.
Yeah, closer to home, but felt very far away from home. So I was really fortunate to be able to join the expedition as a deep sea coral expedition on the RV Falcor, led by Julie Trotter. And we had an international team on the boat, a few students, including myself, and we went to Brommer Canyon, Lewin Canyon, and Perth Canyon. And the amazing thing about the RV Falcor is that they have a submersible. So It's a remotely operated underwater submersible, and you can actually go down to up to 4 kilometers and collect corals or even fish. On the most recent expedition, they were catching fish with a little net with their arm that they control from the surface. And this is one of the corals about to come up on the screen that we were able to collect and bring to the surface. So we were collecting corals from up to 2.2 kilometers deep. A lot different from our normal corals that we're used to seeing, like the ones in the background of the screen on the live chat. And we're bringing them back to UWA to analyze them and hopefully find out a little bit more about the deep and the history of the deep. And yeah, we were out there for 2 weeks exploring places that, like Brett, exploring places that people had never seen before. We were exploring new terrain and got to go deeper than anyone in these 3 canyons. So it's very exciting.
I have heard this fact, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think we know less about the bottom of the ocean than we know about the surface of the moon and Mars. Does that seem about right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's really, really hard to get there. So we had this amazing opportunity to access this ROV and actually get a glimpse of the deep, but it's extremely expensive. There's limited access, and so we were one of the few that got to explore it. So.
You mentioned 3 canyons. Do you mind just telling us the names? Bremer Canyon and 2 other ones, I think.
Bremer Canyon, Lewin Canyon, and Perth Canyon. So for those,
off WA coast, or are they from?
Yeah, they're off the WA coast, the southwest specifically. The expedition has continued up to the Ningaloo coast, so they're covering basically the RV Falcor is going all the way around Australia and circumnavigating it throughout the year. Things have changed a little bit considering our current situation, but they've still been able to go on a lot of dives and continue their research.
Are they still going now?
Yeah.
Really awesome. Actually, you also mentioned some depths, which I found really interesting. You said it was, 4 kilometers deep?
Yeah, we were able to, so the ROV
4 kilometers.
to go up to 4 kilometers.
That's huge. For reference, how deep is the Mariana Trench? Isn't that like the deepest?
I believe 10.9 kilometers deep.
Okay. Yeah, pretty awesome. And you mentioned that you were collecting various things, fishes with the little nets in the arms, but also corals like what's showing up here. So that would be, I guess, a deep sea coral.
Yeah, this is called a cup coral, and this is one that we actually collected and brought up to the surface. So it looks a little bit different underwater than it does here. This is basically, you're looking at a skeleton, and this is a single coral polyp, a solitary coral that lives alone. And they're really fascinating because most corals rely on sunlight for a lot of their energy. They have a relationship with what we call zooxanthellae, which is a symbiotic algae that they put inside their tissue, and then the algae actually gives the coral a huge percentage of its energy through photosynthesis. These guys have never ever seen light until we came along. So they were maybe lucky and not so lucky to see light for the first time.
Blasted.
Yeah, the amount of light that we have to use down there is just phenomenal. But these guys are relying on nutrients in the seawater, so things like marine snow falling down, and then in between each one of these little, we call them septa, the little ridges that stick out, are tentacles, and they would stick those tentacles out, catch food that comes by, or just have them out at all times, kind of fishing for marine snow or any plankton that goes around.
Awesome. And what was I guess, the overall aim of this expedition? Because obviously you collect lots of samples and you went to some really remote, interesting places. Was there a main objective that this project is trying to achieve?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So there were 2 main objectives. So the first one was basically to just explore the biodiversity of these canyons. So we teamed up with the Western Australian Museum, and we had a few scientists come from WAM, and they were able to identify and do the taxonomy on a lot of species. We had a crab specialist specifically. So we were monitoring biodiversity and doing a lot of collections of the deep, since we don't know a lot about the deep. But specifically, Julie wanted to go and look at these deep sea corals, because corals are really fascinating. They look pretty and they're home to a lot of fish. Coral reefs are home to about 25% of the biodiversity on the planet. but they also hold a lot of secrets. They're kind of like little instruments where what you're looking at in this photo is a coral skeleton. And as they grow and make their coral skeleton, the chemistry changes in their growth bands. So they have growth bands like a tree does. And we can actually date these growth bands and look at the chemistry, which changes depending on what temperature is like, how deep they are. So when we collect these corals, we can actually kind of reconstruct what the oceans were like with fossil corals, or monitor what the current status of our deep seas are like. So we're reconstructing temperature, nutrients. We can actually tell where water is coming from and circulating around these corals, which we call water masses. And we can figure out how high or low the sea level was at the time that they were growing. So that's basically what I've been working with.
So you're collecting these corals because in their skeletons they hold, I guess, the history of the environment that they've been growing in for however long their lifespan. What's like an average age for a coral? That's a good age for a coral to get to, I guess.
Yeah. So the corals that I work with can grow to be up to around 1,000 years old. So the longest record we have is 700, but we think they can grow even longer. So cup corals in the deep can grow to be about 200 years old. So these guys are ancient, and if you think about what was happening even 200 years ago, it's pretty phenomenal that you have this coral that holds all these kind of secrets and unknowns that you're holding right in your hands.
We'll come back to corals in a little bit, but I just want to talk about the photo for a second. That's a really beautiful image. Did you take that yourself, or is that a Brett?
So this one that either myself or Anna Hera from the WA Museum took. We had a lot of photos that we were taking. So we have one big file for taxonomic reasons. We're trying to identify the species of corals that we found.
Is that out of the water?
Yeah, this is out of the water. Yeah,
so this is a sample.
This is a sample that we took up to the lab, and so this is a photo that was not an underwater photography kind of situation.
How deep would it been?
This one was probably, these larger cup corals were around 300 meters, 400 meters. Yeah.
So something I guess that really struck me about marine science in particular. I'm an engineer, so we almost never photograph things. Like rarely do we do it, and when we do, it's in a lab situation, nicely controlled. We have something on a bench that we can control the lighting on. But photography in marine science is something that's really interesting. What is the importance of the role of photography, like to the science that you do, and why is it that so many marine scientists are also interested in photography?
I feel like this is kind of a question for both of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
For myself, I like using photography as an educational tool. So I think it's really important to kind of unveil what we actually do and share that with the public, because it's so easy for scientists to have closed doors, and there's a lot of pressure for scientists to be publishing and keeping up, and there's, it's easy to kind of fall behind and not be active, in the media or with the public and engage. And photography really allows scientists to engage with the public, because we have something that, this coral people probably have never seen before. So, and some people in this chat may have never, been able to snorkel on a coral reef before. So to be able to share that through photography, I think is really, really important for us. At the end of the day, the people that are going to be making the biggest changes for us are the public and citizens who are voting. And so the more science we can share through really strong photography, the better.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean,
so Brett, you're the underwater photographer. Do you mind just sharing through a few more of those wonderful images? Because she makes an absolutely good point. Most of these are in environments that most of us have never visited, and certainly have never seen these particular images before. So do you mind just grabbing that reel and
yeah, I'll show
oh, lovely little turtle. Where is that?
So this is in where was this? Oahu in Hawaii.
Oahu.
Yeah. Here's a photo. A bull shark that I took.
Awesome.
So this was part of a larger project working with indigenous or like subsistence fishermen in Fiji, and they were setting up an MPA, a marine protected area, basically a spot where they wouldn't fish so that the fish can recover in that area and grow larger. And to offset some of their costs of lost fishing revenue, they started doing these shark dives. So I was working with them for a little while. But yeah, photography, as Taylor was saying, is a tool to be able to tell stories. And if you publish a paper, maybe that's not going to reach very many people outside of your, I don't know, scientific cohort. But if you can add a little media to it, it can get some more legs, and you can have a wider audience, which I think is important.
You've actually done a lot of work. What are some, I guess, shoots that you'd have done that we might have heard of?
I did quite a bit of coral bleaching photography that went pretty far. This photo was in Al Gore's recent book about climate change, and a few of them appeared in Sydney Morning Herald, the BBC, New York Times, and went kind of everywhere. I feel like things that are really newsworthy tend to blow up and go everywhere. So, and it's important to be there to be able to document that kind of stuff.
Yeah, this was the 2017 mass coral bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef. Brett was able to get some really amazing shots. Use that one with the diver of how expansive the bleaching was in 2017. We also had another event in 2016. So, yeah.
The coral bleaching is really interesting. It's something which I think most of us have some understanding of, but don't really know the mechanics behind it. And I know that in your research, Taylor, you do a lot of work with coral bleaching events. Would you mind explaining how that actually works? All I know is that it's probably temperature related, and then the coral dies off. That's the extent of my knowledge.
He loves to explain this. So
this is like my favorite thing to talk about. So I'm very excited. Not for the corals necessarily, because you know the rate of mass coral bleaching that we're seeing, especially in the last 5 years. So Brett just pulled up one of his photo series. It's a really nice GIF that shows corals that are bleached, which is the white, and corals that are healthy, which is when they look kind of like more of a richer color. They look like rich brown or kind of darker pink color. And that tells us that a coral is healthy. They can be colorful and be healthy. But when you see corals that, like the one on the very top that looks almost fluorescent, it's actually a bad thing.
The white one?
There's one next to the white one that's kind of like a bright purple color.
The pinky purple one, the tiny one at the very top.
Yeah. And what gives coral its color to begin with actually doesn't come primarily from the coral itself. This is a really healthy reef flat. You can see those nice rich tones. If you look at a coral polyp, which is the animal which lives inside these hard skeletons, and all of these skeletons in this photo are actually colonial corals. So each one of the little kind of dots that you see on these images are going to be where a coral polyp lives. And coral polyps are related to jellyfish, so they're clear. And they have little tentacles that they stick out of the little hole that they kind of make their home. Their home's made of calcium carbonate, so they precipitate that out of the seawater, and that's white. So when we see corals that are bleached, what you're seeing is actually a clear coral polyp with a white skeleton below it. What we want to see is a lot of the symbiotic algae inside of the tissue of the coral that gives it its color. This algae that has grown to have a relationship with the corals that the corals need to survive, it's usually going to be a browny green color, and then we can get pinks and yellows and other colors coming from antioxidants that the corals produce. But in short, what happens is when we have high temperature events, like we had specifically, this is 2015, where water temperature on the GBR in summer months was around 28. And then if water temp goes up to about 30, it actually really stresses the coral out. What happens is the algae starts producing it starts photosynthesizing and producing a lot of energy, a lot of glucose for the corals and food for the corals. But the byproducts that it also produces, normally in a low amount, it starts producing in a high amount. And that actually starts poisoning the corals. And if you imagine being a coral polyp and having this little symbiotic algae inside your tissue that sustains your life and gives you up to 90% of the energy that you need, of course you want to keep it as long as you can. But if it's going to poison you and kill you, you're going to get rid of it. So the corals actually have the ability to expel this algae, which causes them to lose their color. So they go from, say, this nice purple color.
Yeah, so this one's healthy, this image, a bunch of healthy corals. And here's...
to a bright white. So these corals have all lost their zooxanthellae, or the symbiotic algae. And the two plates, the flat parts on either side of the branching coral, those have actually died already. And you can see fish on the left side that are starting to graze on the turfing algae that's covered the coral skeleton. So nothing ever goes to waste in the ocean. Every bit of real estate, and this is actually really great. I didn't notice this, but this fish on the left side.
That's a new data, okay.
This is the first 2015 image. The fish on the left side is a fish that eats coral polyps. The fish now are fish. So if you go back, these are sturgeon fish. The first one was butterfly fish. And those sturgeon fish are eating the turfing algae. So you have a complete changeover of system dynamics when you have the corals dying. They still have the structure, but you have different fish kind of coming in and out of these ecosystems and changing. So the corals that the fish are feeding on have died. The ones that are white have the potential to come back because they still have a little animal living inside of their tissue. And then if we go to the next photo, you can see that water temperature actually stayed high for a long period of time, which meant that the coral couldn't take that symbiotic algae and put it back in its tissue. So it actually did end up dying, and this is a reef that was highly impacted on the Great Barrier Reef, that unfortunately will not be able to come back. What we can see is maybe corals coming back and using this substrate to found a new colony or a new reef completely. That's coral bleaching in a nutshell, and I could talk about it for another 2 hours.
I just want to segue a little bit, because you mentioned that obviously you used to work on the Great Barrier Reef doing tours and dives. Have you ever seen a shipwreck dive?
Yeah.
Because we have a few questions in the chat log coming through about biofouling. I don't know if that's a topic that either of you are familiar with.
Yeah, vaguely familiar with it. I'm not an expert.
So we're running a competition for context on biofouling. We've asked all the children to come up with ways to either prevent and or solve the issue. But for marine engineers, it's a problem because things will grow on anything that's in the sea, and that causes some problems for us. It makes it a little bit less convenient for us to maybe work with that machinery. But the other side of this is, of course, if things are growing on things under the sea, that's a little ecosystem as well. So I wonder what your take on biofouling is.
In terms of shipwrecks, going back to the shipwreck, they can provide substrate in places that don't normally have substrate. So a great example of this would be the shipwreck called Yangala that's near Townsville. And this is just this vessel that sunk. That it was found probably 30 years ago. And normally it would just be in this sandy channel, and it has huge megafauna all over it. So you get giant whiptail rays, you get huge groupers. It has so much biodiversity on this little hotspot. It's a little place where basically water's flowing by, but the fish can kind of get a bit of shelter and then start out and feed on plankton that's flying by. And so it in one way, shipwrecks provide habitat.
But it's not really a problem to have biofouling on a sunken ship.
Yeah, but I think the big problem with biofouling, is how we manage it on vessels, and using, non-toxic materials to prevent from biofouling. For example, on the bottom of a boat that needs to have a clean surface.
Use paint that.
You can use paint that doesn't have heavy metals in it, that aren't leaching out into the environment, but it means that you have to scrub your hull a lot more often. So there are a lot of people that are committed to keeping our waters pristine and clean. The boat that I used to work on was one of them, and they had anti-foul on the bottom of their ship that didn't have heavy metals in it. So we would just go and clean the bottom of the vessel more often than, probably 4 times more often than any other.
So you just physically go out there and scrub it off. Is it quite hard to do that?
Yeah, it's really hard work. Yeah, because you're either on scuba or on snorkel at the waterline, and you're scrubbing, and the water is going this way and that way. A lot of people get seasick when they do it. So yeah, it's definitely hard work, but worth the hard work.
The alternative being to use something which perhaps would prevent the growth, but might actually harm the environment in the long term.
Yeah, a lot of the most successful anti-fouling agents, and again, I'm no expert, but they have heavy metals in them, which can be toxic to marine life.
What about aluminium?
Oh, there you go.
Guys out there. Doesn't that resist growth? I don't really know. I'm out of my field here.
Sounds like a
Do you
good
know, as an
question
engineer?
for the...
Yeah.
I don't know either. I know that the major ways to sort it out, one would be a preventative coating that is in some way a little bit toxic to organisms, which is how it works, right? But in the long term, that's obviously not a good solution. There are also, I think, chemical removal methods which are quite harsh but do work. Again, that's going to cause some kind of damage to the local ecosystem that's being established. Mechanical removal, which is what you mentioned, physically scrubbing it, either with a person diving or probably with an ROV. But again, that's hard work and it's a lot of work. You've got to go get in there and slowly, layer by layer, kind of take that off. And with the marine growth that we're talking about, it can be hard calcified growth, right? So that's physically quite hard to remove. There's also a few slightly more interesting methods. There's acoustic removal, which is when you apply sound waves and vibrate things off, which might be an interesting solution as well. But I think that's the thing. For us, it's a huge inconvenience as engineers to have the growth. But once it's there, it is a site of ecological richness. So what do you do? If it's so developed that you've got a whole reef going on and you've got corals and fish living around it, how fair is that to remove it? I'm not sure.
Bringing it back to the corals, it was amazing seeing the biofouling just on the around the slips and on the Great Barrier Reef. When we would go back to Port Douglas, you would see all these corals on the docks that could live in this extremely toxic, hot, muddy environment, and we actually saw them go through bleaching events as well. So it was interesting to see the kind of biofouled biodiversity in the marina even.
Nice. Actually, we'll bring it back to corals in a little bit as well. But I do want to talk about conservation because I know you're both very passionate about conservation in your various ways. I guess, when did your interest in this area first start? Was it something that you've always been interested in, or did this grow over time?
You go first, I've been talking a lot.
I suppose I always had an interest in it, but the more I learned, the more I piqued that interest. So originally I studied marine science. I did undergrad marine biology degree, and I have a master's in marine biology as well. Studied back home in California. And yeah, a big focus was conservation. And I feel like maybe if you studied marine biology 60 years ago or more, it was kind of the prime time where you just went around and explored and looked at things. It was like, what's over there? Oh, that's cool. But nowadays,
discovery.
Yeah, nowadays we're finding out that a lot of things are declining, and it's scary for us to see, and it kind of pushes you to try to do something about it.
What's like the most startling fact that you know off the top of your head that puts the problem into perspective?
50% of the corals in the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah, mine would be corals. Theme-oriented here. But just in 2016, 2017 alone, the first year of mass coral bleaching, we lost, which was due to climate change, we lost 29% of shallow water corals. And then the following year, we lost 19% of shallow water corals in the mass bleaching event. Now this is a system that is the size of Italy. So imagine one habitat that comprises, the majority or all of Italy, and then half of that habitat kind of sparsely disappearing over time. It's pretty scary, especially considering how much we rely on these ecosystems. There are a lot of ecosystem services that coral reefs and rainforests and habitats all over the world that are quite vulnerable to climate change provide for us. So that would be my,
big. That 20% loss, was that an irreversible event? So this is lost forever, or is this recoverable over time?
So those corals are gone, but what can happen is that the corals can kind of use the substrate of the dead coral. So new corals, we call them planula when they're in the water column. So after spawning, they'll float around, and then they need a hard substrate to settle on. So all of this new dead coral, as long as it doesn't get too much slimy, slippery algae all over it, and we have enough fish to kind of clean and clear these areas for corals, they can be re-inhabited by new corals. And what we're going to be seeing is a big shift in the number of species. So we're going to get less biodiversity, less number of species of corals, and more robust corals surviving bleaching events. We actually have a mass coral bleaching event as we speak right now on the Great Barrier Reef that has kind of encompassed the entire reef this time in 2020. The last month was also the hottest month temperature-wise on record on the Great Barrier Reef since we have instrumental data. So a lot is changing, but we can do a lot as well. And the fact that we still have a lot of the Great Barrier Reef is fantastic because that means that it can still keep reproducing if we change what we're doing on land.
So getting back to conservation, I feel like it's important to tell these negative stories, but on the flip side, it's very important to tell the success stories, not to stick with the doom and gloom, but show places that are really pristine so that people know what we can lose, I guess, and also be inspired to protect those places. The footage we have up here, this is not the Great Barrier Reef, this is French Polynesia, but an example of a healthy reef with a lot of life on it. And I find a lot of people, they react positively to seeing the pristine places as well, not just the negatives.
Is this more what you're hoping to achieve with your work when you're showing us all these exotic, beautiful places?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I try to get around to some of the hot spots around the world and document what we have.
So I've got to ask, what's your favorite spot in the world to photograph? What's the place that makes you think this is a beautiful paradise that we must really, obviously we need to preserve all of it, but is there a particular place that sparks your interest?
I will say, maybe it's because I'm just returning from there, but South Georgia. This is an island that's in the Southern Ocean to the east of the tip of South America. It's absolutely incredible. There's probably more wildlife that you can see on one beach than you can see anywhere else in the world. You see that many photos here. I guess just underwater photos, but I took this maybe weeks ago, just offshore of South Georgia. This is a king penguin, and it's coming. This is in Gold Harbor, and that's a beach that has hundreds of thousands of pairs of these king penguins. It's as far as you could possibly see. It's just penguins, tightly packed, and
it's happy feet for miles.
Exactly. And then amongst that, there's fur seal pups, hundreds of thousands, or basically everywhere you can see there's fur seal pups just underfoot. It's an amazing, amazing place, and that's because of the productivity of the Southern Ocean. It has a lot of currents, a lot of upwelling in that area, and since the water's so cold, it can bring nutrients up from below. So a lot of food in the water, let's say. And all these animals that you find on land, they're not necessarily land animals. They're sea animals that are coming up to shore for a reason. The penguins are raising their young on land, but it just speaks to the productivity of the ocean. An incredible place to visit.
So this was the recent trip you did before the self-isolation, I guess.
Yes.
Was this the same one where you mentioned there was a citizen science project with microplastics?
So we try to do that wherever we're going. We'll take a little net out and we'll do a microplastics tow. And then we're partnered with Woods Hole, a science at Woods Hole, and we added their database. And it's kind of a nice thing because it's the recent trip wasn't really hard science. It wasn't a hard photography expedition. It was more communication based. We're taking guests to a far off place and teaching about the environment there. But it's a way that those tourism dollars can kind of give back because it's very difficult to get to those locations. So we can do science in places that's really hard to go to. We'll do that. We'll do bio blitzes when we get on land to kind of document all the little plant life that we come across.
And did you say bio? Was that the term bio blitz?
Bio blitz, yeah.
Bio blitz. Okay, that's fun. So what's a bio blitz?
Bio blitz is where you basically send a bunch of people out with cameras to document every bit of life that you can come across in a certain area. And you can upload it to, there's many apps out there like iNaturalist, which will add it to a database where people will ID those little bits of life. It could be plant life or insect life or anything. And that can then be accessed by researchers around the world to determine the range of things. In South Georgia, it's important because with the slightly changing climate there that they're experiencing currently, and also with foot traffic and the like, invasive species are on the rise. And on the peninsula as well, and in Antarctica, with the warming climate, suddenly things that wouldn't be able to last the winter can now possibly last. So we're documenting changes and seeing if there are things kind of coming in and changing the landscape.
There you go. So the citizen science project, which means I guess anyone technically could participate if they wanted to.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I'll give a plug to that app. I really enjoy using it when I'm just out and about. It's called iNaturalist, and anyone can use it. You can take a photo of something and upload it, and experts will look at it, or people who
also artificial intelligence is able to give you suggestions of what the species may be.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it gives you a bit of information back, and then it adds to a data set that's accessible.
That's very cool. We'll definitely give that a bit of a plug in the description when we re-upload this. But the microplastics thing, this is the surprising thing. So you went to Antarctica, one of the most remote places on Earth, I guess, and you were there looking for microplastics.
Yeah. You want to know if we found any?
Yes, I do want to know if you found any. Please say no, you didn't.
So currently, in all of our tows, we haven't found any microplastics in Antarctica, which is encouraging. We don't find any plastics on the shores either. With the currents in the Southern Ocean, it seems to create a bit of a barrier. So plastics that will be coming from the north, from South America, or from any of the gyres, tend to get kind of sucked back into those gyres and don't make it across into the I guess Antarctic Peninsula or the continent itself. At least that's what we're seeing. I don't know if people have found things other places, but currently it's looking okay for Antarctica. But we'll see.
So last week we did obviously our ocean pollution special with Julia Rice. So when we talked about the ocean gyre. So if you want to know more, watch that back. But good to know that for now, Antarctica seems safe and good to go for now. But that brings me up to something which I've heard, which is not Antarctica, but the Arctic, and the concentration of microplastics in the food chain in particular. This is something which earlier you were talking about subsistence fishing, and I wonder if you know anything at all about, I guess, the way that we utilize the resources in the sea as human beings, and perhaps what, in terms of our efforts, what disruptions you're seeing.
Yeah, so come again, in the Arctic.
Yeah, so I've heard this fact that in the Arctic you can find microplastics building up in the food chain. So obviously a fish will eat some microplastic, and then that fish will get eaten by a carnivorous fish, and that might get eaten by somewhere an apex predator like a polar bear, for example, and then you'll end up finding it building up in the food chain. And earlier you were talking about subsistence fishermen, and it just made me think about, I guess, our reliance on the ocean, and also what the impact of human activity will be on us as well.
Yeah, it's certainly important to protect because we draw so many resources from the ocean. As far as plastics, and once again, this is not my specialty. But
I have a bit that comes close to home.
Okay, Taylor.
About WI.
But I don't know if so much plastic is being accumulated in tissues, but plastics that float in the ocean are really good at absorbing pollutants, and those pollutants can then be passed into tissues, and then those can be going up the food chain, kind of just passed on up and up every step until you have a tuna or something, and then that can be taken out, and that can be passed along to us as well.
Yeah, so we call that process bioaccumulation, where you have your predators at the top of the food chain, your big predatory fish like tuna, that can bioaccumulate toxins more so than smaller fish because they're eating lots of the little fish. What we have seen is that even locally in Western Australia, the Australian herring are showing up with plastics in their gut content. And this is part of a research study down in Albany. And so it really hits home for everyone, us in Australia and all over the world, where we're seeing these fish bottom of the food chain with plastics in their gut. And then potentially, this is where a lot of new research is developing, is looking at how much of the toxins, specifically persistent organic pollutants, which have been, DDT, for example, which has been in our ecosystem and stayed there since the 60s, even though we're not using it anymore. DDTs can actually get absorbed to the surface of plastics, and then they don't like water at all. They're hydrophobic, a bit like tuna. And so the second that
in a different way,
the access, to go into tissues, they're going to go from that gut content into tissues. And so that's a growing area of research at the moment. There are studies on whale sharks and their accumulation of what we call phthalates, which make plastics flexible, which can disrupt the endocrine system or the reproductive system of large animals, well, all animals. So stay tuned to science, because I think there's going to be a lot more data coming out.
Yeah.
I just want to go to the live feed because I have a really interesting question that just came through. Biofouling again, but related to what we just talked about, which is food chains and humans and consumption. If you eat biofouling, what would happen? I think we need to break that one down. So biofouling, growth of organic organisms on man-made structures. What would happen if you ate corals and algae and the fish around it? Can you eat corals? Can you eat corals?
You should take this one. There's actually...
Like, because he's eating corals.
That is no matter. You did a photo series there.
The Jowlow.
Yeah.
Do they eat corals?
They eat corals. They're nomadic.
No, really?
And they travel around in canoes, and they'll set up in one location and basically forage and eat specific types of corals. Obviously, they can't eat the ones that are made of calcium carbonate. That's limestone, so you can't really go chomping down on.
Okay. So the ones we saw before, the white ones with the antler-looking ones, maybe not those ones, but there are corals that you can eat.
Yeah, there are soft corals that people do eat, and I met someone on the Great Barrier Reef who was from one of these villages, and he was telling me about what they went around and ate. Corals, ate a lot of algae. A lot of you have probably heard of sea grapes. And so they
had those in the last episode as well.
Oh, really?
Yes.
And so then they just move, and before they exhaust all the resources on one reef, they'll move to another reef and then harvest there and then make the rounds every year.
It's probably just a surprising
answer.
It's a part of their diet. They don't only.
I did a
So I guess the answer to the question is, what would happen if you eat biofouling? You'd be fine. Just choose the right kind of coral and you'll be okay. You can eat them.
Anti-foul paint that they're on.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. So yes.
Yeah. You don't want lead. If you have lead I guess you wouldn't have anything living on it. But anything close to lead, you don't want to be eating.
No. That's so surprising. I did not. I guess. Hey, so that study that you were talking about, fishermen, where was that again?
So this was shot in in northeast Borneo.
Borneo, okay.
And it was on a nomadic fisherman group. They're called the Bajau Laut. And the photo you see here, there's two of their boats. They're called lepa-lepas. And there were 4 generations living on each boat. So pretty remarkable. Really, really skilled fishermen. They dive with handmade goggles.
Oh my goodness.
So it's with a bit of glass and then a wood carved pocket that fits specifically to each eye.
That's amazing.
Made personally for the person, and they are able to dive really remarkably deep, like 50 meters on these.
Without oxygen or anything like that.
Free diving.
Yeah, free diving, and hold their breaths for minutes and minutes on end. So really remarkable fishermen, and really clever as well. I went out with them, and they were setting these fish traps. So you see there's like a little mesh trap in the bottom there, and they were taking loose corals, dead corals, and hiding the fish trap underneath, because they knew that fish will often hide amongst corals. And so that they just left it out there, didn't bait the traps, just left them kind of hidden like that. And they would come back in days' time and gather the fish that went in for cover and got stuck in the nets. But what was really remarkable to me is we were out maybe 2 miles or something offshore, and they didn't set any floats or markers up. And I asked, how are you going to find this? And they just laughed at me. Like, what do you mean? We know our reef. It's right here. We're just in the middle of the ocean. Crazy.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, really remarkable people. Beautiful, super friendly and opening. And yeah, they live completely a subsistence lifestyle. So they travel around and go where the fish are, and there is a little tinge of a sadness to the story, because as fish stocks are declining with big kind of commercial fishery operations coming into the same areas, they're having a harder time collecting what they need. So many of them are building shacks like this and going to more of a terrestrial lifestyle, let's say. They're moving to the cities, but for them, they still need some water underneath them, so they'll build a home above the water currently.
So this is a lifestyle that is declining a little bit.
Yes, probably not very sustainable in the very long run, just in today's climate. But one that is still going on.
Is it just because of a decline in fish stocks, or are there other drivers for this change as well?
Well, fish stocks would be a big one, because they're competing with commercial fishermen, and they're going down and spearfishing, so they're not on the same level as a large trawler or commercial vessel. But there would also be some climate considerations with corals declining. That they're in the Coral Triangle, so they're basically going from Borneo to the Philippines and Indonesia. And there's also just some political issues, because they're a nomadic group that lived amongst many different countries. Now countries have come in since after they were doing this, and kind of put up borders, so it's a little bit more difficult for them to get around. But I'm really inspired by what they're able to do and live sustainably within within the ocean, and being able to live your whole life more or less on a boat is incredible.
It would suit the both of you.
Yeah,
it's not for me. I'm landlocked. I can't be doing that. We're at 10 minutes to the end of the show, so I want to just do a call out for questions from our chat log. Any last questions that you've got about Antarctica, about coral reefs, about microplastics, about our wonderful subsistence fishermen? Please pop them in the chat log. This is your very last chance. We'll just see what comes through.
Sounds good.
A few more questions around biofouling, which Janie P is answering beautifully. For those kids who are participating in the competition, feel free to shoot through an email that will pop through in the description as well, because I know that you're looking for quite specific information around the growth of reef-like structures or man-made machinery in the ocean, and also waste dissolvers. So we'll try and sort you out as well. But that just popped up. Brett, what's going on there? Is that you?
That is me in the water, yes. So this is in Nome, Alaska, just underneath the Arctic Circle. In the middle of winter, or I guess maybe a little bit after the middle of winter, we have some sunlight. And we're a couple kilometers out on the sea ice, and we're digging a hole and diving in the water. It's part of an interesting project on gold miners, strangely, but
underwater.
But it's an example of getting into really cold waters and diving down underneath the ice and encountering kind of a really quiet.
Is that a leopard seal? No.
No, so this is in the north. There's no leopard seals.
Yeah. How much I know about the ocean.
No, it's all right. This one is really chubby and friendly looking. Leopard seals are a bit more bitey, I guess. Neck, heads, and jaws.
So earlier we were talking about the fishermen being able to hold their breath for quite a long time. The question through from Rob P. What's it like diving under the ice? You've been there, you know what it feels like. What's it like for the rest of us?
Oh, it's incredible. It seems somehow quieter than a usual dive. And it's just kind of like, it's like a freshly fallen snow. If you go out for a walk, everything's kind of muffled.
That means nothing to us Australians.
Well, let's just say there's a big blanket on everything, and it muffles the sea. It's a little bit darker. It is a little bit spooky. When I encountered this ring seal, I was down looking at some small invertebrates on the ground, like a small sea star, maybe like this big. That was taking up a lot of my attention, and then I just kind of felt like there was something near me, and I look up, and there was a dark shape just immediately above me, and it really spooked me, but it was just this ring seal that was coming to check me out and breathing the air that was kind of underneath being trapped underneath the ice. Incredible experience.
Yeah. A question through from Joe Dorsch about the experience of diving again. How many fishermen are there, like those fishermen that could hold their breath for a long time, do you reckon? I don't know. How many do you reckon?
I don't actually know proper population counts on them. It'd be in the thousands, but
they just did that physiology study on their lung capacity.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a perfect number for you there.
Joe Dorsch, do your own research like a proper scientist. Hey, we don't know is a pretty good answer. You'll find scientists saying we don't know more often than anybody else on the whole planet, because if you don't know, that's great. That's a question that you can go and try and find out. That's science. Question here from Rob P. again. Do you prefer the tropics or the poles? Both of you have travelled quite extensively. What's your preference?
It depends where I am at the time, I think. At the end of a trip, diving in -1 degree water, going to Tahiti sounds really nice. But as far as what you can see, I don't know. The variety is the flavor of life, I guess. So I like both.
I mean, the Ningaloo Reef just here on our WA coast is phenomenal. We have so much biodiversity. We were both just blown away after working on the Great Barrier Reef for 4 years. And then moving there, we just were mind blown at how much megafauna there is there. And there's just it's teeming with life. This is a great example. We have the humpback whale migrations off the WA coast. And as numbers have been rising, there have been more carcasses washing up. And a carcass washed into the Exmouth Gulf. This is one of the pectoral fins, so these guys. Exactly, that one.
So they're equivalent of the arms, right? The whale arms. So that's a whale arm. That's disturbing.
The life that it brought in was just phenomenal. So we have a tiger shark that's circling here, and this actually isn't the same tiger shark. There was a rotation of, I think, we looked at the markings, and there were about 6 individuals that were kind of taking turns feeding on this whale carcass. That's a theme in the poles and in the tropics, that nothing's going to waste. So this whale fall in the Arctic or Antarctic would look a lot different than the tropics. And I'm hoping to get to the Arctic and Antarctic to dive. one of these days.
I'll tell you, it's much more convenient to swim in the water in the tropics. You know, you just have to put a scuba tank on or maybe a snorkel and jump in. The process to gear up to dive in Antarctica is pretty elaborate. It takes a while.